Alright, this video is on why Natalie Bollinger was such a shitty excuse for a human being. When I went to Virginia, it was at Natalie's request. I've already proven that time and again with Natalie's own words and her own messages to me. When I got a hold of her to let her know about the abuse, she blocked me. When I got a hold of Alicia to let her know about the abuse, she blocked me. When I got a hold of Maddie Boa to let her know about the abuse, she argued with me for a bit and then blocked me. However, at least Maddie Boa admitted in our messages between each other, which, by the way, I posted those up on my YouTube here. She admitted that all I did was get stuck in the fucking road. That's not molestation. That's not rape. That's not stalking, and that's not murder. Now, that wasn't the only issue that I had. See, after Natalie's death, there was the public pretenders who would not do their jobs. That's why I've been attempting to pursue these people. Every time a police officer did wrong, they were very condescending to me. They knew that what they were doing was criminal and against the law. They knew that I didn't have the money for an attorney. Without somebody going in with me, they weren't going to do anything. Now, the courts, they made sure that every time that somebody went in with me to the courts, that they didn't hold the actual court proceedings. When Alyssa Rainwater showed up to my court in Arapahoe County, they magically didn't have court for me that day. They postponed it. Alyssa Rainwater can verify this. Even if she's pissed off, the fact is she was aware of the abuse, and that was part of the abuse. Now, the public pretender's office. There are public pretenders repeatedly did illegal and immoral things that can get them disbarred from being lawyers, from practicing law. One of the things they did, I'll talk about Pamela Carty in specific on this one. Pamela Carty repeatedly did not show up to our appointments. The 2 appointments of ours that she did show up for, she had one of her bosses. She actually came in 2 different times with 2 different bosses to force me into a panic attack, to let me know she was not going to requisition the evidence that was stolen by officers. Now, there was, on both of those occasions, her bosses were heavily involved in trying to have me committed by calling me crazy, because I had already threatened to sue them for not doing their jobs, for not showing up, for not investigating anything. Literally, they did nothing. At that point, it became a conflict of interest for Pamela Carty to represent me. Now, there was the pre-trial proceedings that I was supposed to be allowed. Pamela Carty pretended that she got into a car accident so that she wouldn't have to show up and represent me there. The man who did show up, I don't know his name, so I can't press charges against him or take him to court. Now, that was because Pamela Carty pretended that she got into a car accident. She didn't. She didn't get into a car accident. She pretended. Now, those pre-trial proceedings were already passed when they were allowed to keep me locked up without having them. Instead, that man who was her replacement let me know that if I didn't sign their paperwork, that I had to plead guilty. That's literally what he was telling me. He was telling me that he wasn't going to represent me and that they had not made any effort to requisition the evidence. And meanwhile, police officers are literally torturing me in the jails and telling me that I can get a hold of a lawyer when I get out. I can get a civil lawyer when I get out. I can file a report when I get out. Meanwhile, I was pretty sure that they were going to pull some bullshit and transfer me to a different county, transfer me somewhere out of jurisdiction, and Pamela Carty was attempting to help them. There was also, when I was served with the protection order in the jail, magically Pamela Carty couldn't be reached for an entire week. Meanwhile, at least 3 of the people that I was incarcerated with had Pamela Carty as an attorney and told me that she was there. She was supposedly at a conference somewhere else. So, the court proceedings, where I could have actually shown what these police officers were up to in a court of law, and shown what the Bollingers were doing in a court of law. The proceedings where I had literally broken the law to try to force those proceedings to happen, well, they held them without me. And the judge in that case claimed that I had made no effort to go to court. That's complete bullshit. The officer who showed up handed me the protection order paperwork while I was incarcerated, and then he handed me a piece of paper for habeas corpus. When I asked him, what the hell am I supposed to do about it? How am I supposed to get there? I am incarcerated. I filled out that paperwork for habeas corpus, and I had to turn it in to 2 officers who I had had previous issues with. Officer McRae and Officer Thorne. Sorry, Deputy McRae and Deputy Thorne, 2 of the guards in the jails. Deputies McRae and Thorne had put me on suicide watch for attempting to file a report against them, and I have copies of those. The problem is that officers are not going to investigate their own officers. They kept telling me they couldn't have an investigator show up. They told me that probably 100 times at least. Actually, it was probably literally 1,000. I mean, I spent the entire time that I was there trying to get an investigator. Meanwhile, the evidence that showed what all of these people were up to, that I had literally broken the law to try to force an outside agency to look at, because none of these departments were willing to investigate it. None of them were willing to investigate their own officers. Finally, when the officers sat down with me, it was to have an administrative review to put me in the hole, because I had been trying to get a police officer to come take my report, an actual investigator to come take my report. They told me that they couldn't do that. They also told me that the only officers who could do that are the ones who had gold on their badges. Those 2 officers who showed up that had gold on their badges told me that they weren't going to investigate their officers because they trust their officers. And they don't trust any of the inmates. That's assuming my guilt. That's also turning a blind eye to police corruption and police wrongdoing. There are many inmates in that jail who wrote reports and were witnesses to what happened to me in that jail. Now, Pamela Carty, I had attempted repeatedly to try to get a lawyer who would actually do their job. But the judge, on the 15th of October, just 3 days before my birthday, refused to allow me to get a different lawyer. She said I had to stick with the one that I was assigned. Pamela Cardi had not done her job even once. She repeatedly did not show up. Finally, she showed up with another lady who was her superior, and mind you, I still don't have the name of that judge. They're making all sorts of claims about not having any evidence and so on and so forth, and things like I have to go down there in order to get that. Well, on the 15th, the judge refused to allow me to fire Pamela Cardi. She should have been fired at least 7 court dates earlier. Now then there's the situation of the 18th of October, my birthday. Literally the night before is when Pamela Cardi and her boss showed up to coach me into what I should say at court. That I was to pretend that Pamela Cardi had done her job. Otherwise, I would not be released. Now on the 15th, what sent me into a severe panic attack was that Pamela Cardi didn't tell me that there were warrants out for my arrest. She blindsided me with that in court. She didn't tell me at court. She spoke about it to the judge in the court. That's how I found out. Then she claimed that she had taken care of those warrants when her and her supervisor showed up on the 17th of October. And while they were pretending and coaching me into how to lie, literally, I was just trying to get out so that I could file charges against the officers in that jail. On the 18th, Pamela Cardi outright lied to me again. She said that those warrants were taken care of, and of course they had coached me in what to say, and since I wasn't allowed to show evidence and they'd already done everything in their power not to allow me my pre-trial, which by the way is null and void because you have a certain amount of days for that pre-trial to happen, and they didn't hold my pre-trial until well after their legal limit for doing so. Every jail that I went to, I was abused in. See, that's what happens when you try to turn in officers. Everywhere that you go, officers treat you in a hostile fashion. They make fun of you and tease you and harass you. Sometimes with a big-ass smile on their face, like Officer Hahn the other day. What a fucking piece of shit. Of course, he only did that because he was being recorded and he knew it. He thought it was fucking funny. So, on the 18th of October, I thought I was going to get a great and wonderful birthday present. I was finally going to get released from jail and I was going to be able to press charges against these officers. Pamela Cardi had told me before court that those warrants had been taken care of. She had told me the night before that she had taken care of them as well. And then, of course, right before I'm supposed to be released, they tell me that some warrants magically showed up on their computers. The very same warrants that Pamela Cardi said that she had taken care of. At that point, I needed to press charges against Pamela Cardi, and I wasn't allowed. I had not been allowed to fire her for not doing her job. I had not been allowed to record her coaching me and how to lie in court. I had not been allowed to record any of that. The fact is, what she did was immoral as all fucking. Same thing with those officers. At no point in time were my constitutional rights or my legal rights observed. by anyone in the criminal justice system. Holding court without me repeatedly, preventing me illegally from going to court, lying to me to protect their own asses, refusing to allow me access to the evidence, stealing evidence. Now, they held court for me in a few of the court dates that I was there for, and I had literally gone to every single court date until I was illegally prevented from going to court. Literally every single court date, over 20 of them in 7 months. And I went to every single one. I couldn't afford to take care of myself because of all the court dates. And on the court dates where people showed up, they continued it. Or they would magically not hold court. They wouldn't inform me that I didn't have to show up to court. They allowed me to waste what little funds that I had to go to court without informing me of what was going on. And as a result, I literally could not take care of myself. I could not afford food. I could not afford rent anywhere. I could not take care of myself because none of these people actually did their jobs. I shouldn't have had to break the law in order to get a goddamn court date. And they should have never been allowed to hold court without me being allowed to be present. I should have been allowed to fire my public pretenders for not doing their jobs. I should have been allowed to face my accusers. However, I had to deal with alcoholics and procrastinators. I had to deal with Shannon Alvarado being an alcoholic. She should have come forward with what was going on with Kara Johnston Miles, who, by the way, was able to make a police report about me all the way from Texas. And Shannon Alvarado claimed that she wasn't allowed to make a police report because she was out of state. With all due respect, if Kara Johnston Miles, who is doing illegal things, is allowed to make a police report from Texas, then Shannon Alvarado should be able to make a police report about what that woman was doing from California. Because no officer would investigate. Every officer made excuses. I ended up getting fucked. When Graham showed up with me to court, they postponed it. When Steve Tombleson showed up to court, they postponed it. Every time they postponed it, it cost me $300. There was $100 for going to court, $100 to go see my public pretenders who didn't show up, and $100 to go see the investigators who didn't show up. Meanwhile, I couldn't hold the court date and see my public pretender and see the investigator all in one day. Oh, of course not. That would be too easy, wouldn't it? So every time, the reason it cost me $100 is because I had to go back to places where I was abused in order to have court. Because the courts were being held in places that I was being abused. So before court, I had to drive down to court. And then after court, I had to drive away to somewhere that I was actually reasonably safe. On the 18th of October, my birthday in 2018, at 11 o'clock, when I was supposed to be released, they finally told me that I wasn't allowed to be released. Now, Then they transferred me to Larimer County Jail, where I was assaulted by police officers within 20 minutes of being in the jail. They shoved me into a room that had blood in it and spit all over the place. It was quite unsanitary. It's disgusting, and they keep that cell dirty for a reason. I saved the names, as many of them as I could, and I wrote them down. Repeatedly, police officers refused to investigate their fellow officers. Repeatedly, they stole evidence. Repeatedly, when I made a report to them, they would give me condescending answers, or they would throw away the report, sometimes right in front of me. I was repeatedly abused. And Pamela Carty outright lied to me repeatedly and coached me into lying in court. The public pretender's office knew that she had done this. They allowed her to walk away. Being transferred to Larimer County prevented me from filing charges against the Boulder Police, and it prevented me from filing charges against the Boulder County Sheriff's Department, and it prevented me from filing charges against the Public Pretender's Office in Arapahoe County and the Arapahoe County Jail, as well as at least 20 Arapahoe County police officers and Sheriff's Department deputies. You don't get treated like a human being when you're charged with assaulting a police officer. And those charges were dropped. You guys who have been paying attention got to hear that conversation with the Public Pretender's Office. That was Amanda Balehash way back in January, on January 6th of 2018 is when that incident happened, when I was assaulted by Waylon Lolotai, Waylon Lolotai. Look that name up on the internet. You'll see what it is that I had to deal with. That man assaulted other people as well. He was let go from Denver Police Department for assaulting people in exchange for not having charges pressed against him. And as a result, he was allowed to be a law enforcement officer in Boulder. Boulder specifically hires people like that, hobo hunters, people whose job it is to threaten, harass, intimidate, and assault the homeless. Officers with no morality. So, like I said, jurisdiction. These officers and public pretenders repeatedly used jurisdiction. Number one, to prevent me from being able to file reports against them. Number two, to eat up all of my money. Number three, most of the public pretenders that I had moved on, as well as many of the officers. Officer Cody Selhorst was allowed to escape justice by moving to South Dakota. Officer Jordan Anderson was allowed to escape justice by moving out of state Nebraska as well. Pamela Carty was allowed, because I was prevented from being in the jurisdiction where I needed to be to file charges, and I was prevented from firing her as my public pretender. She was allowed to move to a different jurisdiction so that she couldn't be pursued and so that her testimony could not be recorded. And then there's Amanda Balehash, who was promoted to being a judge in Arapahoe County. This is my public pretender who is supposed to be my public defender when I was assaulted by Waylon Lolatai, and I was charged with assault. And then there is the county prosecutor here. The county prosecutor here, his name was Joel J. And because I was attempting to go after him as well, he was given a judge's position in Kansas. All of these people who did me wrong repeatedly were allowed to escape justice because I was illegally prevented from making a report or having those reports investigated. I was repeatedly lied to, threatened, and intimidated by law enforcement and by my own public pretenders. The bullshit that they pulled is illegal as fuck. The judges saw it and heard it. On the 15th of October of 2018, the judge who I was attempting to get to allow me to fire Pamela Carty for repeatedly not doing her job, repeatedly going out of her way not to do her job. Criminally negligent is the term. That very same judge on the 18th of October, who should have known, because only 3 days earlier we had held court with that same woman. That very same judge should have known that I had been coached because of what I said. I was threatened, harassed, assaulted, and intimidated into my statement on the 18th. Where she sits down and she asks a whole list of questions that Pamela Carty had coached me into what to say, knowing that the things that she was coaching me into saying were under false pretenses, were for an agreement that was never made, and over warrants that she had never taken care of. The only reason that I pled out to that was because I didn't have a real attorney willing to do their job, and because I was given promises that were never fulfilled. My intent when I got out of the Arapahoe County Jail was to immediately file reports against those officers and Pamela Carty in Arapahoe County. Instead, I was transferred to Larimer County, over 2 hours away. And in Larimer County, without a vehicle, there was no way I was going to be able to get back to Arapahoe County to file charges against Pamela Carty. I was abused because I had no money. And I had no money because of the assault by Waylon Lolatai. In specific, Waylon Lolatai's assault against me on January 6th of 2018 was the cascade that prevented me from getting an honest court date, that prevented me from being able to go to police officers. That's what happens when they charge you with assault against a police officer, even when they drop the charges. That's why I was so pissed off that Amanda Balehash did not do her job, because she was involved and had information on jurisdictional issues in at least 3 other counties, including Adams County, because she spoke with the detectives in Natalie's case concerning my computer, which they never returned. And because I couldn't go back there, without being threatened, harassed, intimidated, assaulted, or arrested. They made sure that I never got that computer back, or the evidence on it that shows the wrongdoing of the Bollinger family, or the police officers for that matter. At no point in time were my rights observed. All it would have taken was one person willing to go in there with me. Now, if somebody isn't willing to go in with you, or if they procrastinate, or if they're sick, or their child is in the hospital, or they have warrants and can't go in, does that make it legal? No. But it does make it okay. It makes it okay because if there are no witnesses, then they can do whatever they want. I was locked up with over 200 separate inmates. Now, there's 1,800 inmates in the Arapahoe County Jail, but I was locked up with at least 200 of them because I was transferred to different pods. Because I spoke out about what the officers were doing, and I was actually able to get other inmates to write down reports about what they had seen and what they had heard, including the harassment, threats, and abuse against me. Those officers kept on shipping me to other pods, shipping me out, refusing to look at the evidence, and throwing people's police reports away. They even repeatedly offered to do special favors for those who did write reports, to try to get them to retract their reports, including extra lunches. That's called a bribe. They attempted to bribe inmates. How fucked up is that? Now, how does this make Natalie Bollinger a terrible excuse for a human being, you might ask? Because she could have just told the truth. Instead of spreading slander that resulted in me being physically harmed, she could have either told the truth or just kept her mouth shut. There was no reason for her to go spreading slander. However, as soon as she started spreading that slander, I needed an honest court date. As soon as she started spreading that slander, the first thing I tried to do was get her, Maddie Boa, and Alicia Bollinger to put a stop to it. The second thing I did was go to police officers about it. The third thing I did was go to my friends about it. Now, I had attempted to go to Miss Peaches before I ever went to an officer. That's not entirely true. I went to Miss Peaches in December of 2016. And my first interaction with Jordan Anderson was January 8th of 2017. But the first time that I spoke to a police officer about the situation was while I was in Boulder in November of 2016. And I don't remember the name of that officer. Another officer I had tried to speak to about the situation is Officer Abel Ramos. He died of cancer. Another person that I had attempted to speak to it about was Anna Hunka. She died of a seizure. Another person that I had spoken to about it was Janine Barrett. That's Derek Parrish's mother. She died of a heart attack. One person who was actually willing to help me with it, especially since it resulted in the death of Natalie Bollinger, was Rory Jepson. I don't know what he died of. People keep telling me that it's the CIA and the FBI who are killing all these people with special brainwaves and medications that are untraceable. You know, I don't want to lend anything to those rumors. I don't. Now, I'm not saying that there's no possibility of that, but what I am saying is that right now, in my mind, that's up there with alien conspiracies and Illuminati conspiracies and shit like that, that really, there were no aliens involved. There was no Illuminati involved. It was people's selfish motivations. Natalie's selfish motivation is that she didn't want everybody to know that she was on heroin. She didn't want everybody to know that her father molested her and raped her. And you know what? If she had just told the truth to begin with, that never would have happened. I never would have had to do that. I threatened to blow my head off in front of Maddie Boa and Natalie Bollinger because I couldn't see my loved ones because of abuse, repeated abuse. Repeatedly, when I went to the police in Boulder, Colorado about the abuse that I was enduring, they blew me off, both before and after Natalie's death. I needed access to those body cameras, and I have been denied that. Any lawyer worth a shit could have gotten me off on every single charge that I was charged with just by looking at the evidence, looking at the fact that literally there was nothing else I could do to try to stop what was going on. There was nothing else I could do to try to force the police to do their jobs. I had to try to get the FBI to do their jobs. I had to try to force an outside agency to look at what all of these different police officers in all of these different jurisdictions were doing. And by the way, they do this across the United States. Your arrest record is different from your conviction record. If you were arrested for assaulting a police officer, whether you assaulted that police officer or not is arbitrary. Whether or not the charges were dropped is arbitrary. The fact is that still shows up on your arrest record, and you need money and an attorney to get that off of your arrest record so that you don't get treated the same way by every officer you encounter after that. Officer Hahn never should have been here yesterday. I should have had a protection order against him last year. I was attempting to get a protection order against him this year. However, the lady in the clerk's office, or the magistrate's office here in Chapel, Nebraska, told me that she doesn't know how that works. That she doesn't think that that works with a protection order because it's the sheriff's department that's supposed to serve it. It has to go through the sheriff's department. I had attempted to get the police to take a report from me repeatedly before Natalie was killed because so many people were threatening my life and harassing me and assaulting me. All of these people that I'm pissed off at that offered to help and never followed through, I'm pissed off at them for a reason, because I will have to deal with that abuse for the rest of my life. I won't be able to see my loved ones without being abused for the rest of my life. Why is Natalie Bollinger such a terrible excuse for a human being? Because all of this happened over her slander, and her sister's slander, and Maddie Bo's slander. Now you can look at my medical records. Repeatedly, these hospitals wanted to claim that I was on drugs and use marijuana usage as their excuse for not listening to me. They didn't write down any of the stuff that I told them because they wanted to protect themselves and protect the officers. What the officers had to say mattered, and what I had to say did not. Meanwhile, I've never hidden the fact that I smoke marijuana. And the fact is, in most of those cases, I had zero marijuana in my system. I just admitted that I used to smoke. However, there's a big difference between occasionally smoking marijuana and having to deal with addicts like Shannon Alvarado and Natalie Bollinger and Alicia Bollinger and Maddie Boa. Alicia Bollinger, Natalie Bollinger, and Maddie Boa were addicted to meth, all three of them. And two of them were addicted to heroin. Natalie Bollinger and Alicia Bollinger got hooked on heroin because of their dad, who had them selling drugs on Pearl Street when they were 13 years old. I found out that they were drug dealers when they were 18. That's when Natalie sent me that email. In July of 2016 is when Natalie sent that email telling me about her dad beating her stepmother Shelley to the point that she thought Shelley was dead, and about her dad molesting her, and her dad having her sell drugs, and her dad beating her when he got drunk. That's my biggest issue with Rose, is that Rose repeatedly chose abusive men because she's an addict. Ted Bollinger picks very specific women who are broke and homeless and addicted to drugs. And Ted Bollinger feeds them those drugs to try to get them to have sex with him. Unprotected sex. A lot of Ted's offspring have autism or have been improperly diagnosed with autism. They don't have autism, they have brain damage from their mothers ingesting drugs. They have brain damage because their father and his semen were tainted with drugs. Meanwhile, who is it that takes all of the blame and all of the punishment for these things? Is Ted in prison for the rest of his life for the things that he did? No, he's not. Ted Bollinger is just as responsible for Natalie's death as the man who shot her. But you know what? Alicia Bollinger is even more responsible.